We're going.
Alright, I feel honored to be in Mr. Whelan's room. I feel a lot smarter now, and a lot less happy. Mr. Whelan. We're going to go back to chapter 24 in your text. Chapter 24 was that chapter on industrialization. The first thing that we did is we said, look, you had this rapid industrial growth during the Gilded Age, this rapid economic growth. Well, we kind of talked about economic growth and we connected it into industrial growth. And then I said, look, there's a lot of reasons why the economy grew so quickly. And so, extensively. But we pointed to one thing as being central to kind of almost everything in the Gilded Age. Phillips, do you remember what that one thing was? The growth of something kind of influenced, defined, promoted almost everything. Do you recall? Dear Marissa? The railroads. So there's a fair number of questions on the test about the influence, the importance of the railroads. One of the things we talked about was the rail network and it being financed. There's a discussion in your book about financing the railroads and what happened with that. We spoke at length about the Transcontinental Railroad and how that was constructed, the Central Pacific, the Union Pacific, and building that, the financing of the Transcontinental Railroad. What did we say? We said the government supported the construction of the first Transcontinental Railroad. They supported that. How did the government support that? How did they subsidize it? Good, Warren.
They gave to the rail companies 10 miles of land on either side of the track, and they gave them loans to help them build it.
Land grants and loans, right? Land grants and loans was the way they subsidized those railroads, and we talked a little bit about that. And then we said, look, they built 4 other transcontinental railroads that, after that time, and we talked about the government influence. Not all of them were subsidized by the government, but eventually we said that the railroads became a crucial, vital industry that influenced a lot of things and a lot of people were dependent on it. We also said that they were inept, corrupt. The railroads, had, corruption, mismanagement, problems of all sorts. And we said that the result was there were lots of people that cried for reform, for regulation, particularly on the state level, and particularly farmers. Right? Farmers cried for reform. They wanted regulation. They pushed for it. And laws were passed in various states that regulated rail rates and other actions. And we said these were called Granger laws. But eventually these laws were challenged in court. And the railroad said, well, look, you can't do this. You can't regulate our economic activity. You can't regulate what we do. This is a private business. And the question was, could the government regulate an industry that was considered to be in the public good for the public good? And that question was decided in the case of Munn versus Illinois. Does anybody remember the result of that case? Remember we talked about, go ahead, Kristen.
The state can regulate the railroads if it helps the public?
Yes. States can regulate railroads. The court ruled that the states can do, in fact, that. They can pass regulations that regulate the railroads, rates, whatever, if that is in the public interest. But we said that case was overturned by Wabash versus Illinois. What did the Wabash case? Well, the case was kind of overturned. Yes, go ahead.
It stated that the states could only regulate it if it was in their state.
Yes. And so that said that states couldn't pass laws and regulations that would regulate rail rates that went across state lines. So, right, the Wabash decision put the burden on the federal government. If there was going to be regulations, it had to be by the federal government. And the federal government did take action in 1887 to create a commission that would regulate railroads. What was that legislation? What was that commission? Go ahead, Melanie.
Was it the Interstate Commerce Act?
The Interstate Commerce Act created the Interstate Commerce Commission. That was in 1887. Grover Cleveland was the president when that when that act was passed. And we said this, we said, oh yeah, the Interstate Commerce Commission was created, and this is landmark legislation. It's important because it's the first time that the national government is really going to genuinely regulate an industry. But it's not very effective. The Interstate Commerce Commission is not very effective. They really don't have strong regulation. The railroads kind of influence government to manipulate it, so it really doesn't turn out to be effective regulation until maybe the 20th century. Now, after we talked about railroads, we talked about the growth of business. And we said, you know, look, businesses grew. And what you got out of this was the emergence of big business. So not only did you have economic development, not only did you have economic growth, but you had the emergence of big business, right? Big business. Now, we said that these big businesses, these big companies that emerged, were built by entrepreneurs. And we talked about the big businessmen, and we said, look, these entrepreneurs that built these businesses were the dynamic figures of the era. We said that, you know, look, good people went into, talented people went into industry. And we said a couple of things. First, we said that how we view these people is kind of, depends on, you know, maybe our values and what we think is important. And we said some people looked at these big businessmen as captains of industry. People who embodied the American spirit, embodied capitalism, promoted industry, and built, you know, these gigantic companies that have prospered and, you know, promoted the standard of living of the United States for some time. Other people saw them as robber barons. Now, robber barons would be somebody that, you know, maybe advantaged and took advantage of employees and raped the natural environment and cheated. And we said that we weren't going to talk about all of them, but the two that we talked about were Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. Now, Carnegie and Rockefeller, we told their stories, and, you know, what do you need to know? Well, I think what you need to know about Carnegie and Rockefeller is probably the industries they made their money in. Carnegie made his money in steel. Rockefeller made his money in oil. Probably the names of their company, Carnegie Steel, Standard Oil of Ohio. Probably you need to know that Rockefeller built a horizontal monopoly. I mean, probably you need to know that Rockefeller's Standard Oil of Ohio was the first trust. It was the first trust. And what he attempted to do with that trust was to control the industry. You know, to set prices and production levels and to basically take control of competition. Carnegie didn't have a trust. You know, Carnegie didn't have a vertical integration, right? He didn't have a trust. You know, Carnegie had horizontal, or excuse me, he had vertical. He didn't have horizontal. Carnegie Steel built, you know, mines and other things, and he did that, but he did not have horizontal integration like Rockefeller. Also, I asked a question. I didn't talk about this in class. Carnegie is kind of this interesting figure. He's more flamboyant than Rockefeller. Rockefeller is pretty subdued. He wrote an article entitled The Gospel of Wealth. And that's discussed in chapter 24 in your textbook. You should take a look at that, The Gospel of Wealth. And in that, Carnegie is going to kind of justify, you know, his riches and the riches of other entrepreneurs during the time. In addition to justifying his riches in that way, the Gospel of Wealth, Carnegie also was an advocate of something called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism we talked about in chapter 25 in your book, but it is discussed also in chapter 24 in your book. And the question of social Darwinism is, how did the great industrialists justify their accumulation of wealth? And we said that social Darwinism did just that. Oh, who was the British sociologist that was most associated with social Darwinism? Does anyone besides Doyle and myself remember? Doyle. Don't make me call on worms, because I'll do it. Go ahead, Belay, don't make, because I'll call on Worms if I have to. Go ahead, Worms.
Herbert Spencer?
Herbert Spencer. Oh, who was the American sociologist that was the advocate that we mentioned yesterday in class? Go ahead, Jessica.
William Sumner.
Yes, William Graham Sumner. And these guys were advocates of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism applied the notions of Charles Darwin, survival of the fittest, natural selection to society. And basically what the social Darwinists argued is that the great millionaires were the result of sort of an evolutionary struggle. They came out on top. Their accumulation of wealth was natural. It was natural in the evolutionary struggle for there to be winners and losers. Poverty was an inevitability. Wealth was an inevitability, and both of those things were necessary for society to advance. Now, after we talked about the great industrialists and the growth of industry, then we talked about labor. And we spent considerable time talking about labor. And one of the things that we said was that the nature of work changed during this time period. And we talked about Degler, and Degler talked about the kind of the commoditization, the dehumanization, how work became more simplistic, more repetitive, less necessity for skill. You had large numbers of industrial workers working in large factories and in personal environments, and there was sort of a change in the nature of work. And remember, we said that most suggest that the labor movement that we discussed in class was a response to that. It was a response to kind of the change in the nature of work, dehumanization, safety problems, and maybe most importantly, instability. We said the economy went up and down, there were panics and instability, and this resulted in a response by labor, right? And we talked about kind of the history of that. And when we talk about the labor movement, we kind of focus not on workers forming individual unions, but attempts to form kind of national associations of workers. And we talked about the National Labor Union, right? That was gone by 1866. But we spent more time talking about the Knights of Labor and the AFL. Who was the leader that was most responsible for sort of building up the Knights of Labor? Does anyone, go ahead, Marissa. Yes, Terence Powderly, and remember, it is Powderly that really is kind of orchestrates this massive growth. Why did we say, what were some of the things that we said were reasons why the Knights grew so quickly, and what was distinctive about them? Go ahead, Doyle.
Because they almost allowed anybody to join except for lawyers.
Yes, except for non-producers. They allowed everyone to join the Knights of Labor. And they also, they also didn't keep anarchists and socialists and others out. They really looked to unify all workers in one gigantic labor organization. How were the Knights of Labor different from the AFL? Who was the leader, Kristen, of the AFL? We had his name on the board yesterday. Oh, you were not here yesterday. You were here yesterday. Go ahead, Elizabeth. Tell the kids. Gompers, Samuel Gompers. He was the head of the AFL. How was the? Can you, Coulter? Can you tell me one way that the AFL was different than the Knights of Labor?
It was more practical and only the skilled workers could join.
Only skilled workers were welcome. It was practical unionism. Yes.
They weren't afraid to go on strike.
Yes, they weren't afraid to go on strike. They were organized for that. They were militant in some regards. But they endured, and they were clearly the most successful labor organization of the time, which might say something about the nature of labor during this time. We turned from industrialization and urbanization, or from industrialization to urbanization. And when we talked about urbanization, we said one of the big trends of this time period was that firms lost, people left farms and went to cities. And so there was large-scale urbanization. I mean, that's urbanization. I mean, people have to come from somewhere, So what we said was characteristic of the Gilded Age was the growth of urban areas. And we talked a little bit about sort of phenomenal growth of Chicago, phenomenal growth of New York, and these other areas. And we discussed that, and we said this demographic shifts that occurred had to occur because of a push and a pull, right? Something had to push people off of the farm, something had to pull them in. What was the big pull? What was the big pull that pulled people into urban areas during this time? Go ahead, Worms.
Economic opportunity?
Yes, they came to the city for jobs. And they came to the city for jobs from the countryside in the United States, and they came to the city for jobs from urban, from Europe. And that was the other thing we said. What was distinctive about the growth of Gilded Age cities was that you had this massive European immigration, which we said occurred in two waves. The first wave and the second wave, or the old wave and the new wave. How were they different? The first wave went to about 1890, late 1890s. The second wave was 1890 after. How were these two waves of immigrants that came mainly to cities different? Yes?
The old wave was like Northern and Western Europeans who had already been settling in the United States. And the new wave was like Southern and Eastern Europeans who really tried to work.
Yes. The old wave was Northern and Western Europeans, the Germans, the Irish, the traditional immigrants, and they came in large numbers until the late 1890s. The new wave were the Southern and Eastern Europeans, the Italians, the Poles, the Russians, the Russian Jews, the Ukrainians, the Lithuanians, the Estonians, this rich kind of tapestry of ethnicity from Southern and Eastern Europe. And we said that second wave was distinctive in that these people were mainly Catholics, they had a foreign kind of religion, they were largely impoverished, and they were illiterate in their own
Language.
countries. So we talked a little bit about that. We talked about them coming, how most of them, 80% of them settled in cities, that 40% of them, that 40% of the growth of cities was from immigration from Europe and other places. We did mention that some people came here, some of the immigrants that came, many of them were young males. Some of them came, and they came with the purpose of returning. The immigrants that came, made money in return, were called birds of passage. And there's some statistics in your book about that, about birds of passage. We did say that the second wave met significant hostility, that there was a lot of anti-immigrant feeling to the second wave of immigrants that came through. Now, we said that, we kind of nicely did this. We said, well, look, think about this. You got all these people coming with no money and can't speak the language, and they're converging in these cities, and they're settling, and there's no planning, and there's no programs. There's going to be a lot of problems associated with this. So we talked a little bit about how really no one was initially interested in kind of providing any kind of services or assistance for these urban immigrant poor, and how that connected to the strength of political bosses. We talked about political bossism in the Gilded Age, and we said what the political boss fundamentally did was build a machine, a political machine that elected people to various offices. And then through those elected officials, they awarded contracts and bids that were corruptly awarded, and they demanded kickbacks and other things, but they took some of the dollars that they made in these corrupt ways, and they did distribute it back to the immigrant poor in various ways. So we did say that the political bosses got their power on some level from providing at least some services to those that were most needy in these urban areas. Now, that's all right, Melanie. It jolted my train of thought.
Sorry.
Who was the most famous boss? We only mentioned one boss, one political boss. Who was the most famous? Go ahead, Anna.
Marcy Tweed.
Boss Marcy Tweed. And when we did talk about him, I showed you a cartoon. And I said, look, there's only really one cartoonist, and this is the cartoonist that is credited with kind of bringing Boss Tweed down. What cartoonist did I, yeah?
Thomas Nast.
Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast. Now, we said that eventually, I mean, I think at one point we put up on the board and we said, look, here are all these things that were done to address the problems of the city. And on one side of the board we said, here are all the things that were done that kind of suggest that the problems of the urban poor are the fault of the urban poor. Things like immigration restriction, temperance, these were all kinds of things that said, look, these people are poor because of who they are. And then on the other side we said there were some people that came along and said, well, maybe these people are poor not because of who they are, but because of circumstances. And we said that those people included advocates of the social gospel. And we mentioned Walter Russian Bush and Washington Gladden as two people who were advocates of the social gospel. And the social gospel, we said, was this kind of argument that, look, these urban poor are poor not because of their personal failings, but they are poor because of circumstances, and it is the obligation of Christians to do something about it. That was kind of the social gospel. That was the argument. And that it was the obligation of the Christian church to reach out to these people. We said there was also something called the settlement house movement. And who is the most important and famous settlement house worker, Nina?
Jane Addams.
How many D's?
2.
2 D's in Jane Addams. What was the name of her settlement house? Hull House, right? H-U-L-L, Hull House. And what was a settlement house, Phillips? When it was all said and done, a settlement house was a place where, I don't know about that, social services. Yeah, social services, instructional, other things like that, social services, is what the settlement house movement was all about. And Jane Addams was most famous, but there were some others mentioned in there as well. There are a few questions in chapter 25 in your text about topics that we did not discuss in class. And some of them involve education. One of them involves something called the Morrill Land Grant Act. And there's a section in that chapter where they talk about kind of the influence of industrialization and urbanization on education. And actually, it's actually kind of interesting, so you might want to read that. But one of the things they do is they talk about, well, look, some of these great industrialists, kind of endow, big universities like the University of Chicago, Vanderbilt, get it, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Carnegie Tech, University of Chicago was Rockefeller, Johns Hopkins was an actual person that had lots of money, that started a college, and, they talked about that. But the Morrill Land Grant Act provided land grants for kind of state agricultural universities. And the Big Ten is basically, those of you that have some kind of knowledge of athletics, you talk about the University of Ohio and the University of Wisconsin and Penn State University, sometimes are referred to as land-grant colleges, right? Because they were granted the land to build these universities by the national government in these land-grant acts. And so there's a little discussion. You should take a look at that. Okay? There's also a discussion in your text about journalism, right? Journalism. And we really talked about social Darwinism and how it affected. I guess if you're reading your book, it's kind of awkward. The theme of that chapter 25, is how urbanization affected the country. So it kind of starts out by talking about the urbanization, and we spent most of our time on that. And then we kind of hit various topics. So one of them, how urbanization affected and industrialization affected education. We didn't talk about, but I just told you, right? Another that we did talk about is how it affected thinking. And we said that, look, one of the biggest effects of urbanization and industrialization on thinking and culture was this whole idea of social Darwinism. And social Darwinism, affected other kinds of thinking. This notion of an evolutionary struggle of evolution affected a lot of things. you know, we talked about that, and then we said, but not everyone adhered to that. And one of the persons that didn't was Henry George. So there's a question on the test about the two questions on the test about the two big kind of dissenters from social Darwinism. One was Henry George. What do you remember, if anything, about Henry George? What did he write about? He wrote a book, Poverty in Progress, 1879. What was it about? What did it have to do with social Darwinism? Anybody remember besides myself and Nina Quinn? Go ahead, Nina.
That like land ownership that like has to do with your affluence is just luck. It's not really.
Yeah, he did say that. That wealth sometimes is not a matter of kind of an evolutionary struggle as much as it is of luck and good fortune and maybe exploitation. So what should happen? What was the final conclusion according to George? Yeah, go ahead, Mary.
Single tax on surplus land.
Perfect. A single tax on the surplus value of land, a 100% confiscatory tax on the surplus value of land. This was very, very, you know, kind of popular notion. And then there was Edward Bellamy. What did Bellamy say, Marissa? What did he do, Bellamy? Edward. Oh, this Marissa. Go ahead,
Sorry.
Miss Marissa, get it going. Bellamy wrote a book.
Is he the one that wrote about how the other half did?
No, that was Jacob Rees. I should have asked a question about that. I didn't see it on the test, though, or in the test bank. He wrote Looking Backward, right? Is that what you're going to say, Lucy? Looking Backward? What was
I
the?
was going to say he wrote about a place where there was no more competition and no poverty.
Yeah, and that was in the year, remember?
2000.
2000, which was interesting. And Looking Backward was kind of a popular book, and you know, we looked at that, and we also looked at literature a little bit. And we talked about, in the literary world, the battle in this time period was between realism and romanticism. And the reality of poverty and industrial growth caused some writers like Mark Twain to kind of address more realistic topics during this time. Now, that's 25, or 24 and 25. A solid 40% of the test comes out of 27, and that's what we were talking about over the past 4 days. So there are a fair number of questions on the test about the Spanish-American War, about imperialism. Oh, what is imperialism? If we say imperialism, what is it? When we say imperialism, what do I mean? What do we mean by that? Oh, the United States was imperialistic. This is the beginning. To have an empire, what must you have? Yes, colonies. All right? So then ultimately, expansionism is when you expand your influence. The ultimate action of expansionism is to acquire colonies, to expand your influence against the will of the people that you're expanding into. Right? Britain had a colonial empire. We were part of it. We revolted from it. Right? We said we should be able to govern ourselves. We said the great transformation of this time period is that the United States ends this kind of transitionary period with a colonial empire. The Philippines, you know, Puerto Rico, Guam, Hawaii to a lesser extent, where we actually take colonies. Now, we said there was one guy we mentioned in particular who kind of wrote the justification for these imperialistic, and he wrote a book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. Belay, do you remember the name of that fellow? You do not. You're over. Fassetti, do you remember the name of that fellow?
Was it Mahan?
Yes, Alfred Thayer Mahan. Alfred Thayer Mahan. He was the person who wrote The Influence of Sea Power Upon World History. Now, we talked about a number of things, Howard. We said that Mahan and others like him, like Theodore Roosevelt, were jingoes, and they were militaristic expansionists and said, hey, look, the rest of the world is out there in this kind of evolutionary struggle to grab colonies.
Sharia Pringle, please come to the office. Sharia Pringle to the office.
And we have to do it too, right? And so, but we said there were other things, like social Darwinism, the Turner thesis. So what was the Turner thesis? Frederick Jackson Turner, the historian, we mentioned that we said, look, this Turner thesis was one of the things that kind of encouraged expansionism. Does anyone besides Chaw and myself remember what the Turner thesis was? Go ahead, Chaw.
I don't remember.
Darn you. Drac, darn you, yes.
The United States was only successful because of its frontier and it needed to find a new frontier.
Oh, so that what defined American culture and society was conquering the frontier. And what made America the country that was, created our values, individuality, democracy, etc., was the frontier experience, correct? Right? And so, it's sort of...